Does Zizek concretize himself as the imitizing of the eschaton? Why isn't he? And what does that have to do, infinitely more importantly, with the thinking of Martin Heidegger? Um, so why isn't Zizek? Why is he aiming towards this goal of the manifestation of salvation, understood in a Christian universal manner through the conscientia of some agents which have at least a part of what we would call maturity, which would then be understood as the matured form of the Dasman consciousness, which, even though it's perhaps never there in any one of us in particular, it's always parts of it are flashing forward in every one of us, and parts of what is sui generis, or casting its glance out of the moment and therefore being in some way drawn into the binding force of forces which are not the same as the Dasman or the core normative consciousness. You can see how there's a few paradoxes in there. For instance, which one is having the true vision, and what is this region out of which the vision, and what's in a certain way participant of what? Is there, since the Dasman consciousness seems to have to be in each one, each Dasein, but at the same time it could never be the whole, or presumably it's never or very rarely that the whole of a Dasein would be Dasman, otherwise the whole field would disappear. And then would you not have perhaps a return into a different kind of being prior to the way Heidegger is thinking in Anaximander as the first one who, quote unquote, raised his eyes. In other words, in other words, came to the thinking of being, and came to be perhaps in some way bound to or grasped by that dike, or that the customary action of that which would be glimpsed, or which was glimpsed, and which I suppose one would have to say is being continually in some fashion glimpsed, just in the way whenever you read Heidegger, you have these uh, intimations and sort of little neon pointers which keep saying, um, how is it that we're moving between being these wide, the knowledge that we exist at all, as it were, knowledge that we're here at all in the widest sense, and statements about the widest things, ranging from a statement of, oh, there's such a thing as nature and it has a regularity, to other statements such as that good is something that can be generally and truly realized, just as by metaphor, health can be realized in daily life, or the ripeness of a pomegranate, which would be the full, mature, or perfect good of the pomegranate, can be realized. So I think in Zizek, I wanted to make on this point a kind of psychology. Is it psychology? I want to go into personality, so like a personalityology of knowledge. Like, what's the relationship between people's personalities? So, to use the example of Zizek to have some fun, to kick him around a little bit while he's still here. And what's the relationship between his personality, taken as one example of a thinker, or this could go for people in various fields. How does their personality relate to the knowledge they produce? Let's say knowledge meaning just sort of in the daily sense of things that we rely on as knowing, as we know how uh, everybody can understand a little bit the knowledge of hydraulics. Let's say that how water pressure operates. That we know how to run very complicated systems of pipes and things like this. And this is basically knowledge. So there's other kinds of if we go just by that standard without being too poisoned by our intelligence of other strong attacks from a more ontological or overboating uh, position on that, that we could raise all kinds of objections, which would have some cogency if we kept thinking about them. But just going on the daily sense of knowledge, um, then you could say, um, how is knowledge emanating from personality? So we have today, of course, we have many theories that people have different biases, quote unquote, or maybe there could be other reasons, such as juridical reasons based on interest, or based on the reason that spouses can't testify against one another, and all kinds of things. But what is the direct meaning here? In a way, from a Heideggerian perspective, that we're kind of floating through time and grasping certain things and certain uh, outlooks, sui generis. Daseins are grasping things that other ones aren't and being claimed by them and so forth. What's being claimed by a certain personality, and how can we get some grasp on that? So I was thinking of the analogy between Zizek and Han Solo in the Star Wars films, which I don't know if actually are they totally worldwide, universal, quote unquote, classics, or are there wide swathes of human beings that have never heard of these films? That would be some interest in, in the Bhutan or in some other far parts in Uzbekistan and so forth. Are these known there? I'm not certain. But you can see that there is, to the extent that you have here a character who is basically an atheist on one side, so you can see the direct analogy with Zizek there. But then I think the more interesting thing is I've been accusing Zizek of being quote unquote squishy. Like there's something, but what does that amount to? So I think it amounts, and this is why I chose to make the analogy this way. Joseph Campbell says in his analysis of the Star Wars films, he says that the Han Solo character was this kind of fellow that one meets on occasion who thinks that they are out for themselves. So they think of themselves like they're sort of an egotist or something like that. But as it actually turns out, he doesn't use the word squishy, but I guess that's where it comes in. As it actually turns out, instead of going about the business in this sort of a way that I'll call a Gesellschaft style, without any consideration for the community or the friends or whatnot, as Lucas constantly brings out in his so-called space opera. Although Lucas kind of tears himself down on that point a little bit too much, I think it's because of course, it is a very nice and successful work at its own level of depth, I guess, or of how much compound um, worth it has in it, I suppose. But so you see, there's an analogy on that part, but how does that tie up to? You remember, like Hanzo is supposed to pay off the criminals who he owes money to, but instead he blows that off to come back and shoot the wingmen of Darth Vader, and then allow Skywalker to make the kill shot on the Death Star, right? So he turns out to be kind of an old softy, as the line in the film goes. He comes back for the friends. So this motion between the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft, it plays a big role in Zizek. So why does Zizek want to stay in that realm? Whether he's self-deceiving himself, or whether, on the other hand, we see the way he really is, and how those two things move back together. I think that that lines up a little way with his sense that the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft are key concepts for bringing about this imitizing of the eschaton, which would be salvation on earth through finding the correct political order, right? Um, which doesn't have to be understood in too fantastic a way, but you get push it towards it meaning something like Christ consciousness or um, the unmoved mover being realized through our conscientia, or what is translated as conscience, moral conscience, which would then be spontaneously through our habit gains of willing the right things spontaneously realized in daily life, which would be a kind of utopia, um, the ripeness of the apple of human life, if you, as it were, if there were no other factors such as the constant and uh, infinite possible developments of technology and changes in the human being, which would no longer render them human any longer, changes in their physical strength and living forever and all kinds of, the whole transhuman thing. Um, so far as we go down that way, we see sort of an alley that takes us dangerously away from the Western tradition, which puts political philosophy at the center, into the technological tradition, which in a way is it reaches into the singularity, right, or the rabbit hole, or so forth, or whatever you want to call it. We can't see anymore there. So here, I think that this ties in with Heidegger in the sense of the realization of salvation on earth is what Heidegger would refer to as the being of beings coming to its fullness. So, like in Thomas, where you have either negative being or you have full being, same thing. Here, this is the fullest, or as Zizek would say, at its purest, this is the uh, Western presence, being as presence, as Heidegger puts it. So the being as available to us. So everything about being is coming to this possibility of realizing the actus purus through ourselves as a final perfect end, and that's the end of the world. In perfect felicity, and everybody's waking up every moment saying, "I'm so glad that I'm alive," and so forth, and meaning it. So the difference between that, and you could see if you have that view, the fullness of being as presence, being as available, being as a gift to human beings, you could have something like the being as emptiness, or many Eastern views in contradistinction to that in some way. Heidegger himself makes a distinction between the Plato's idea of the fullness of the being, and then Nietzsche's idea of the mere vapor of the being and being that's gone away. But if you instead throw being itself in its radical immanence into an imminent explosion of question, where it's so questioning the mirror of it, we can't. It goes beyond our intelligibility. So that if you let the what's beyond the point, or as Jung puts it, critical reason comes to a halt, be laid down imminently right in front of us. This is, I believe, what Heidegger is trying to push into in his thoughts. So this radical, instead of being understood as available to us, or as empty and totally lost to the subject, or as illusion, Maya, spinning woman, instead of any such interpretation, trying to bring this radical silvery glimpse into a distance, giant distance, um, in its inexhaustibility, alongside the things in some way that we're not quite getting at. So I'll end this with the bookend that just as when one doesn't remember something, but sort of has a hint that one might be able to remember it, how do we actually do that with our mind? How does it happen? We kind of know how to do it. We can set our mind to remembering something, and usually it works. We can actually, if we think we can remember something, we can kind of work at it and remember it. So in the same way, I want to say, in our philosophic and thinking endeavors, there's certain things